The envelope had been sitting on the table for 11 minutes before anyone noticed that Bryn hadn't touched her food. Everyone else at the long cedar table in the back room of the Pemberton Club had already moved on to their second glass of wine. The soft hum of conversation filled the private dining room. Congratulations, toasts, the particular warmth that settles over a table when the people gathered around it believe they are celebrating something real. 70 guests, crisp white linens, candles that cost more per hour than most people earned in a day. Lawrence Aldcroft sat at the head of it all, silver-haired, straight-back, the kind of man who had spent 40 years in corporate law and still looked like he could argue a case in the morning. He was turning 65 that evening, and the room around him had been arranged with the precision his assistant, Agnes, knew he preferred. No balloons, no streamers, nothing that made the occasion feel smaller than it was. Just good wine, good food, and the people he had trusted long enough to call his own. His daughter Meredith had planned everything. She was 32, bright-eyed, already showing the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 3 months organizing an event her father would appreciate, but never quite say so out loud. She stood near the far end of the table, talking to her husband's colleague, and she smiled every time someone caught her eye. She was good at smiling. Her husband, Callum. Technically Callum Hart. Though Lawrence had never once called him by his first name in the 4 years since he'd married, Meredith sat 2 seats away from the head of the table, close enough to be visible, far enough to be comfortable. Bryn was 9 years old. She was Meredith's daughter from a previous relationship, and Lawrence had been the only grandfather she'd ever known. She sat beside him that evening in a dress with small yellow flowers, her hair pulled back with a clip she'd chosen herself, eating almost nothing. She had been quiet since they arrived. Not the quiet of a bored child, but something more considered, the quiet of a child who has noticed something and doesn't yet know what to do with it. The envelope sat in the middle of the table near the gift display, slightly apart from the rest, tucked between a leather-bound box and a bottle of scotch with a tartan ribbon. It was plain white, no embellishment. It had Lawrence's name handwritten across the front, in a script that was careful, deliberate, almost formal. Lawrence hadn't opened it yet. He'd been working his way through the pile. Cards from old clients, a framed photograph from his junior partners, a wristwatch from Meredith that he turned over twice in his hands before setting it quietly in its box. The envelope was last. He reached for it. Bryn put her hand on his arm. It was such a small gesture that almost no one noticed. But Lawrence noticed. He turned to look at her, and something in the steadiness of her expression made him pause. Not alarm. She wasn't frightened. She was focused. The way a child looks when they are trying very hard to say something they can't find the words for yet. "What is it, love?" he said, low enough that the nearest conversations didn't slow. She looked at the envelope, then at him. "I don't think you should open that one," she said. He studied her for a moment. "Why not?" She pressed her lips together, and he could see her deciding whether to say the rest of it. "I saw Callum put it there," she said, "when everyone was getting their coats. He put it in his jacket first, and then he put it on the table when no one was looking. And then he looked around to see if anyone saw him." Lawrence was quiet. "But he didn't see me," Bryn said. At the other end of the table, Meredith had begun the process of gathering everyone's attention for the toast. She tapped her glass twice, smiled around the room, and started to say something about her father's work ethic that she'd clearly rehearsed. Lawrence watched his daughter's face while she spoke. He had always been able to read Meredith, the small hesitations, the particular brightness she'd deployed when she was hiding something. She had inherited his composure and his talent for concealment, both, which had made her an excellent lawyer and an occasionally difficult daughter. He looked at Callum. Callum was watching Meredith give the toast with the practiced expression of a devoted husband. He was 41, handsome in the way that photographed well, and had spent the last 4 years making careful inroads into Lawrence's professional world. He had asked to be introduced to 2 of Lawrence's largest clients. He had asked Lawrence to review a property deal he was structuring. He had, on 3 separate occasions, raised the subject of the firm's succession planning in a way that was friendly enough to be deniable. Lawrence had noticed all of it and said nothing, because Meredith loved him, and that had seemed sufficient. He looked down at the envelope. He picked it up and held it, without opening it. It was heavier than a card, stiffer. There was something inside it that was more than paper, the edge of something rigid pressed against the back of the envelope when he pressed lightly with his thumb. Bryn was watching him. He set the envelope back on the table. "Do you know what was in it?" he asked her quietly. "No," she said. "I just know he wanted to make sure you'd see it. He moved it twice, so it was on top." The toast ended and the room broke into warm applause. Meredith made her way toward her father, with the particular relief of someone who has finished a speech and survived it. She put her arms around him from behind and kissed the top of his head, and he reached up to squeeze her hand. And for a moment the only thing in his chest was how much he loved her and how long he had loved her, and how deeply he wished the evening were simpler than it was turning out to be. "You haven't opened the last one," she said, nodding at the envelope. "I know," Lawrence said. "Open it," she said. "I think you'll like it." He looked at her face. She met his eyes with something that was almost entirely steady. "Almost. Did you see what's inside?" he asked. "Callum organized it," she said. "He's been working on it for months. Don't say anything yet, just look at it." Lawrence was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you know about it before tonight?" Meredith blinked. "Of course. It was a joint gift. From both of you." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He picked up the envelope and turned it over. He looked at Callum down the length of the table, and Callum raised his glass slightly, a small private acknowledgement between men who have never been friends but have conducted themselves as though they were. Lawrence set the envelope down. "I'll open it later," he said. "Tonight, I just want to enjoy the room." Meredith's smile didn't change, but something behind it shifted. Later was closer to 11 o'clock, after the last guests had gathered their coats and the staff had begun folding the unused napkins and stacking the charger plates. Meredith's younger brother, Patrick, had stayed to help carry things to the car. Agnes, Lawrence's assistant, was overseeing the transport of the gifts. Bryn had fallen asleep in her chair with her cheek on her folded arms, the clip still holding her hair back, and Lawrence had sat with her for a few minutes before anyone thought to move her. He had put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He did not open it in the restaurant. In the car on the way home, sitting in the back with Bryn buckled in beside him, Meredith and Callum had taken their own car ahead. He took the envelope out and held it. The city slid past the windows, orange-lit and quiet. His driver, a man named Ernie, who had worked for him for 16 years and had the rare quality of perfect discretion, said nothing. Lawrence turned the envelope over. He pressed along the back again and felt the stiff interior. Not a single sheet, but multiple. Documents, perhaps. Or photographs. He thought about Callum's face during the toast, the patience of it, the slight quality of waiting. He put the envelope back in his pocket and looked out the window. He opened it at his kitchen table at midnight, with a cup of tea he hadn't drunk, and the house completely quiet around him. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first was a letter, typed, 2 pages, addressed to Lawrence's firm's board of directors. It outlined a proposal to transition the firm's senior partnership structure, specifically the equity stake that Lawrence had built over 4 decades, into a new arrangement. The language was legal in character, but not from his firm. It had been drafted by someone who understood corporate structure well enough to be dangerous. At the bottom, in the signature line, was Lawrence's name, not signed, printed, ready for a signature. The second item was a document Lawrence recognized immediately. It was a copy of his personal discretionary trust, the vehicle through which most of his private assets were held. He had never given a copy of that document to anyone outside of his estate counsel. The copy in front of him had annotations in the margins, penciled, precise, identifying the clauses that would allow for a restructuring of the trust's named beneficiaries. The third item was a personal note, handwritten, 1 page, on paper that had no letterhead. It was not signed. It said, "Lawrence, the structure here protects Meredith's long-term interests and simplifies everything considerably. All it requires is your cooperation. It would be much easier for everyone if this conversation happened before any decisions were made. Consider this an opening." He read the note twice. He folded all 3 documents back into the envelope with the care of a man who had handled sensitive materials for a very long time, and he set it on the table in front of him, and he sat with it for a long time. He thought about the phrase, "your cooperation." He thought about the phrase, "much easier for everyone." He thought about Bryn watching from her chair in her dress with yellow flowers, saying, "I just know he wanted to make sure you'd see it." He called his estate lawyer at 7:15 the next morning. Her name was Vivienne Corrigan, and she had the quality that Lawrence valued above most others, which was that she had never in 30 years told him what he wanted to hear when the truth was different. He described the contents of the envelope. There was a pause. "Lawrence," she said carefully, "how did this person get a copy of your trust document?" "That's what I need to know," he said. "The annotation suggests someone with professional training," she said. "Not a layman, someone who's done this before." "Yes, and this was presented as a birthday gift, in a manner of speaking." Another pause. "Have you spoken to Meredith?" "Not yet. Do you know if she's aware of the specific contents?" Lawrence looked at the window above his kitchen sink. The morning was gray, the way October mornings in this part of the country often were, and the elm tree in the back garden had gone fully yellow overnight. "I think," he said slowly, "that she may not know exactly what was in it. I think she was told it was something to do with simplifying my estate, and that it was good news." "That's a very particular kind of not knowing," Vivienne said. "Yes, he said. It is. He did not go to Callum first. That was the instinct of a man who had spent his career watching other people make the mistake of confronting the wrong person first. He went instead to the source of the breach. The copy of the trust document that should not have existed. It took Vivienne 3 days to trace it. The document had been accessed through a file-sharing platform that Lawrence's firm had used briefly during a period of transitional document management, 2 years earlier. The access had been authorized under a client file that had since been closed. The person who had authorized the access had done so while employed by a small consulting firm that had since dissolved. That consulting firm had been founded by Callum Hart. The paper trail was not clean enough to be criminal on its own. Whoever had structured it had been careful, had anticipated that the trail might be examined. But it was unambiguous in its direction. Vivienne presented the findings to Lawrence on a Thursday afternoon in her office on King Street, with the documents laid out across her conference table and a pot of tea growing cold between them. "You have options," she said. "This is not nothing." "I know it's not nothing," Lawrence said. "The question is how you want to proceed." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to proceed in a way that doesn't destroy my daughter." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "Those may not be entirely separate things." "I know that too," he said. He asked Meredith to come for dinner on Saturday, just the two of them. Bryn was at a friend's birthday party. Callum was at a colleague's event in Oakville, and the window was clean and private. He made the dinner himself. Roast chicken, which he had learned to make the year after her mother died, when cooking had been the only thing that kept his hands occupied and his mind from going somewhere he couldn't afford to go. He'd been making it for Meredith ever since, on the occasions that required something real. She arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine she set on the counter, and a studied casualness that told him she already suspected the evening was not only dinner. They talked through the meal about ordinary things, her caseload, a renovation she was considering, Bryn's new interest in drawing. Lawrence listened. He asked questions. He was genuinely interested, as he always was, and he set the conversation aside, in the careful way he had always set things aside when there was something that needed saying. When the plates were cleared and she was holding the second glass of wine she probably hadn't needed, he reached into the folder he'd set on the counter that morning and placed the envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. "You know what that is," he said. It was not a question. A long beat. Then, Callum said it was estate planning, that it would be good for the family structure long term. "Did you read it?" She looked at the table. "He said it was technical, that you'd understand it better than I would." Lawrence kept his voice level. "Meredith, I know." Her voice was quiet. "I know how that sounds." "He accessed my trust document through a firm he controlled," Lawrence said. "He had someone draft a proposal that would have restructured my equity stake and my estate in a way that would have been very difficult to reverse once signed. And he packaged it as a birthday gift so that I would open it in a public setting, in a good mood, surrounded by people I trusted." She didn't say anything. "The note inside says it would be much easier for everyone if I cooperated," Lawrence said. "That's not estate planning, that's leverage." She was very still, the kind of stillness that Lawrence recognized from her childhood, the stillness that preceded tears she was trying very hard not to cry. "I didn't know about the trust document," she said. "I didn't know how he got it. He told me he'd spoken with your assistant. Agnes has worked for me for 9 years. She would not have given it to him." "I know," Meredith said. "I know that now." "How long have you known it wasn't right?" Lawrence asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "There have been things," she said carefully. "Things I told myself had explanations. There usually are. He's been—" She stopped. Tried again. "He asks me about your firm, about the succession, about what you've told me about the trust. And I've answered him because he's my husband and I didn't think there was anything wrong with." She stopped again. "I was protecting him." "I know," Lawrence said. "From my own father." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed. The candle Lawrence had lit on the table when the light got low had burned down to a short stub, wax pooled around its base. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on what you want to happen." She called Callum that night from Lawrence's house, from the den off the hallway, with the door partially open. Lawrence was in the kitchen. He did not listen deliberately, but the house was quiet, and the conversation found him anyway. She was calm. That surprised him, and also didn't. Meredith had always done her clearest thinking when the situation required it, regardless of what she was feeling. She told Callum that her father had opened the envelope and read its contents carefully. She told him that an inquiry had been initiated, and that certain documentation had been traced. She told him that she would be home in the morning, and that she needed him to understand before then that she was not going to be placed between her husband and her father again. She used the word again very deliberately. Lawrence noted that. 3 weeks later, in Vivienne Corrigan's office, Callum Hart signed a document acknowledging that the materials in the envelope had been obtained improperly and that no claim arising from the proposed restructuring would be pursued. In exchange, Lawrence agreed not to pursue criminal referral at this stage, a decision that Vivienne had argued against and that Lawrence had made anyway, for reasons that were entirely about his daughter and not at all about Callum. Meredith filed for separation in November. She came to Lawrence's house with Bryn the first weekend after, and the three of them had lunch in the kitchen, and Bryn drew a picture of the elm tree in the back garden, still leafless now, bare against a white sky, and gave it to Lawrence without comment, which was its own kind of comment. He had it framed. He put it on the wall in his study, beside the window, where the morning light came in earliest. Lawrence restructured his estate in January, quietly, with Vivienne and 2 other lawyers he had trusted for over 20 years. He removed all informal fat access to any documentation through third-party platforms. He changed his advisory team. He had a long conversation with Agnes, who had not given anyone access to anything, and who received, for the first time in her 9 years with him, a significant bonus and an apology for the question having been necessary to ask. One morning in late January, Bryn came to stay for the weekend, while Meredith attended a work conference in Montreal. She arrived with an overnight bag, a book about migratory birds that she'd been reading at school, and the information that she had recently decided she wanted to be an ornithologist, or possibly a judge. She hadn't decided. Lawrence made pancakes. He let her choose the music. She picked something with too much percussion that he didn't recognize and didn't ask about. She sat at the kitchen counter on the high stool she'd been sitting on, since she was small enough to need help climbing up, and she ate and read her bird book and occasionally shared facts about Arctic's terns that Lawrence absorbed with sincere interest. At one point she looked up from the book and said, as though it were a continuation of a conversation they'd already been having, "Are you okay, Grandpa?" Lawrence considered the question the way she deserved, which was carefully. "I'm getting there," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her book. He stood at the stove and turned the next pancake, and thought about an envelope sitting on a table, and a small hand on his arm, and a child's clear voice saying, "I don't think you should open that one." He thought about what it would have cost him if he had. Not only the legal exposure, not only the firm, but the slower damage, the feeling of having been fooled in his own house, as on his own occasion, by someone who had learned to look like family. He thought about Bryn watching from her chair, patient and unnoticed, seeing what no one else had thought to look for. Some things you learn in 40 years of practicing law. Some things, it turns out, a 9-year-old in a yellow flowered dress already knows. He slid the pancake onto her plate and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The morning light came through the window the way it always did, indifferent and clean, and somewhere above the city a flock of something. Starlings, perhaps, or the beginning of something else, moved across the white sky and was gone.